If you're happy with the same old ways of dating,
If you enjoy sucking at communication,
and you have no desire to improve your romantic life, then our podcast might not be for you.
but if you want some out-of-the-box ideas to deepen your current relationships,
broaden your sexual horizons,
develop a better understanding of yourself,
or learn more about non-monogamy,
Then you've come to the right place. I'm Jace,
I'm Emily.
and I'm Dedeker.
and this is the Multi-Amory Podcast.
Songs I know I did, forcing me to form myself to fit.
On this episode of the Multi-Amory Podcast, we're doing part one of a two-part series about the question, what makes a relationship inspiring? We found that when push comes to shove, it's often challenging to recall relationships in your life or relationships that you know of that are inspiring. In this episode, we're going to talk about what does make a relationship inspiring, as well as how to make your own relationship become one of those inspiring ones, or your own relationships become those inspiring ones. This episode, we're going to talk a lot about some of the work of Esther Perel, as well as various other writers who talk about relationships. But Esther Perel specifically was the catalyst for exploring the topic of this episode.
I'm going to hop in here. Is this a hashtag relationship goals kind of thing?
I kind of thought, yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
I know we've talked about the relationship goals thing on our podcast before. It always feels really weird to me. It's like I get it when people, they post their freaking wedding photos on Instagram and it's like hashtag relationship goals. Like I get that, but
Wait, hold on. Do people post pictures of their own weddings and say hashtag relationship goals?
oh god, yes.
Oh.
Do they? I don't know.
I thought that
Yeah.
was just
Oh, gosh,
something you
yes.
posted about other people's relationships. Or like you'll post a cool picture of like a couple, hiking a mountain
No, I
and
mean,
then you're like hashtag
yeah.
relationship goals.
Yeah.
or something.
I mean, I've definitely seen every single picture of the Obamas is
Right.
just like hashtag relationship goals. And
Well,
I'm like,
yeah.
I'm into
Or
that,
Obama
sure.
and Joe Biden being like hashtag
Or yes,
relationship goals.
definitely.
Well,
definitely. No, I've definitely seen people who will like post a selfie of them, like kissing their significant other and
I
be like
see.
hashtag relationship goals. Now, bear in mind, I do not usually like these people for doing that.
Meaning, but like, okay, so it's saying hashtag relationship goals, like, I did it. I reached this goal.
I think
of,
so.
Of
yeah.
kissing.
Yes.
We finally did
I
the
finally kissed.
big K, as we call
Uh-huh.
it here.
On the Multi-Amory Podcast.
Yes.
I mean,
no,
I feel like
I-
I could go off on a whole tangent about how relationships shouldn't necessarily be goal-oriented, and it's hard
Sure.
to pin that down because
We've talked
there's a lot
about
of
that, yeah.
motion and flux and
Mhm.
fluctuation. But anyway, let's not.
But I
Can
do
I
think
talk
this,
about why?
Yeah, this is a little bit
No, let's just keep cutting off Emily. Hashtag relationship
fine.
goals.
hashtag relationship
Hashtag
goals.
like Jace was like, Emma, you better be ready to go. And then Dedeker's like, no, I'll go, bitch.
It's okay. No, please, Emily.
Yes, tell
Get
us.
us actually started in what we're supposed to be talking about today.
Thank you. I will. No, about a week ago, I was sitting at the kitchen table and we were, Josh and I were eating and we decided to put on an episode of This American Life. And it was great. It was with Esther Perel, who we may have talked about before on the show. I know that
Definitely.
it comes up a lot in the Multi-Amory Patreon group. She's a Belgian psychiatrist, I believe, and she also writes a bunch of articles for different publications and also has written a few books and is phenomenal. But she and Ira Glass were talking. She actually did an excerpt from her new podcast that is out currently called Where Should We Begin? And yeah, that excerpt was in the This American Life, and then afterwards she and Ira Glass were talking, and I'm just going to read a little bit of what they said. So Ira Glass
Can you
asked her,
wait, Emily,
yes.
Emily, can
What?
you please do an Ira Glass impression when
yeah,
you read
please
this
do.
quote from him?
God damn. Oh.
The funny thing is, Ira Glass's voice is so high, and your voice is so
No, I
deep.
know.
I don't even know
know.
how you would accomplish it.
I really I don't want to be mean or anything. Can I not? Or Jace, do you want to? Do you want to do an Ira
I think
Glass
Jace could
impression?
probably do a good.
No.
Jace could do a good Ira Glass impression.
No, I do a much better Roman Mars than I do Ira Glass.
I can try.
I mean, yeah, sure.
Okay.
He's very like all over the place with his movement and words. It's like in your opinion.
In your line of work, if it makes you feel hopeful for most couples and hopeful for the idea. Wait, what? This line doesn't even make sense, Emily.
Well, this is what he said. He's like he was asking like in your line of work, does your line of work meaning if it in your line of work, if it makes you feel hopeful for most couples and hopeful for the idea of people finding what they want with their partners. So he's asking like, does her line of work working with people on the show that she does, and then also obviously just over time, does it make her hopeful that they're going to find what they want? And so she had a very long pause, and then she said, you know, the thing that just popped into my head is I have days where I have faith in humanity and days when I don't. And then she says, I'll answer you from a different angle. I once wanted to write an article on couples that inspire, and I asked about 60, 70 people at that time if they knew of couples that inspired them. And the vast majority could sometimes come up with one. And I never wrote that piece, but it's the answer to your question, right? It's that we can see some couples who are very good at this and some couples who are very good at that, but we don't have many models where we just say, wow, this is who I want to be, this is how I want to be. And I was like, shit, I mean, how many like actually inspiring couples come to mind when you say, like, do I know anyone that inspires me that is a couple? And then what does make a couple that inspires? So I wanted to kind of delve into that today, because I really, off the top of my head, didn't know of any.
Yeah, I feel like most people, like when I think about people talking about that topic, like people will maybe toss out like my grandparents who've been married for 70 years, you know. But I don't know, I feel like it seems like there's a part to romantic relationships. There's so much that we don't get to see, right? They're like icebergs.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And they're, you know, you only see 10% of the surface and they can cause a shipwreck.
Yeah, but like I don't think that longevity necessarily makes a couple inspiring.
Yeah, but a lot of people do.
Yeah,
I know.
that is often used as a
So-
benchmark for whether a couple was successful or not. It's just how long they've been together, not actually how
Yes.
happy they are or anything else.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
totally.
The way that we've broken down this episode, you know, for all you listening today is, you know, again, based on a lot of like Esther Perel's work, as well as some other writers and researchers and things like that. There are kind of 4 broad categories we wanted to hit for, gosh, I don't know, just things to kind of be mindful of in relationships, and, you know, things that Perel herself, as well as, you know, many other psychiatrists and couples therapists, and also, you know, myself in my own work, in my own line of work, you know, things that have come up in relationships that are healthy and solid, that are kind of, I guess, I wanted to say the memes that you see, and using memes not in the funny sense of the word, but in the serious sense
like
of the
in
word,
the scientific
as in
sense.
like the scientific sense of like reoccurring things that come up again and again.
Right. Like, yeah, ideas essentially that get passed along.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think what I've loved so much about Esther Perel is that she doesn't necessarily come from a standpoint of being super pro polyamory or pro non-monogamy or anything like that. But I think in her writing, she's definitely very much pushed a message that still is kind of goes against the grain, I think, of what we're traditionally taught about relationships and what we should do. And so
I think she's pragmatic about it and about understanding like relationships are changing vastly. And she says a lot that non-monogamy or that even cheating has pushed couples to change their relationships in these really fundamental ways, because it makes them speak about things that they might have never spoken about before.
Right.
Yeah.
So, if I can just give a quick rundown before we hop into it, you know, the 4 categories that we're going to cover today. We're going to cover particularly sex life and sexual intimacy. We're going to be talking about autonomy in relationships, and we're going to be talking about respect, a little bit of a tricky one, but also really interesting to talk about. And then also talking about a sense of self. And all those things are kind of related to each other to a certain extent.
Yeah, definitely. Do you want to get us started on the very first one, talking about sex life?
Yeah, the sex life one. So I'll start off with a quote from Esther Perel. She says, "If love is an act of imagination, then intimacy is an act of fruition. It waits for the high to subside so it can patiently insert itself into the relationship. The seeds of intimacy are time and repetition. We choose each other again and again, and so create a community of two." And I think, the community of two thing is really interesting because, at first, obviously from my standpoint, I want to be like, but what about more than two? However, it does make sense because the thing is that, like, even at the end of the day, you're still working often with a foundation of dyadic, as in two-person relationships, even if it is multiple two-person relationships that are happening at the same time. So anyway, a lot of what Esther Perel talks about is she talks about something that's called the paradox of intimacy and desire. And so it's the idea that as two people start to grow intimate, and I don't mean like sexually intimate, but just like intimate, grow closer to each other, that builds more trust, that builds more security, but that also means that desire starts to diminish. And that's not news to anybody. I think that culturally we've come to accept that, we understand that over time in a long-term relationship, obviously it doesn't feel as passionate or exciting or as thrilling as it did at the beginning. But I think culturally how we deal with that has been not so great, because I think we kind of tend to rail against it and kind of get freaked out about it and worry that means that something's wrong and we're really trying to get it back, Well,
I feel like in a way we kind of ignore that balance, like that culturally we tend to ignore the idea that as you build this kind of intimacy, that sort of novelty and excitement and passion that maybe started the relationship goes away. And yes, we acknowledge it, but I feel like the way I see it get acknowledged a lot is in this sort of negative joking way of the fire is gone, or that's sort of this negative shitty thing that's like, well, crap, I guess, shouldn't have gotten married or whatever. It's kind of in this more negative way. Or it's the movie where they first get together and they're so passionate and then the movie ends and it's just like happily ever after. And you don't sort of see that, right? And I think that I would argue that it's not something that we necessarily are taught the wrong things about, but just that we don't talk about it much at all. Or at least not in a realistic, pragmatic way.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it's something that Perel speaks about a lot, and something that I think, obviously, the three of us have asked ourselves is that is novelty kind of the key to a great sex life? And then on the flip side, how can those who are monogamous or those with even a long-term partner, even if you're polyamorous, how can they still cultivate a really terrific sex life? So from her writings and from other things that we've spoken about, we wanted to come up with a couple things of how to maintain really great sex. So some of these are coming from a Huffington Post article entitled "Mating in Captivity, Esther Perel Reconciles Sex and Marriage."
And something that I do love about this list is that I feel like every other list that I've seen on the internet that's about trying to get the spark back or trying to get the passion back in your bedroom, they're all very specific in the sense of it being buy new lingerie, go to a sex club,
right,
buy a particular sex toy, have a threesome, that it all very much focuses on these sex acts, I suppose. And what I really love about this here is that she focuses on kind of more general fundamental things to be looking at in your sexual connection with your partner, that is going to help you be able to kind of maintain a really good sex life for a long time with them.
Yeah. So to start this out, and that's that to start with the understanding that intimacy doesn't guarantee good sex. And I think this is, if we look back at that quote that Dedeker read at the beginning of this section here, is that if love is an act of imagination, then intimacy is an act of fruition, right? So fruition meaning we've planted something, we've watered it, and it's taken a while for this to grow. That intimacy is something that can take some time to come there, and as she says after that, it waits for the high to subside so it can patiently insert itself into the relationship. And I think that this is something that we tend to talk about, I think, in like culturally, we tend to talk about this in a fairly, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of irresponsible way, or kind of a juvenile way, where we'll look at, this idea that like, oh, the best sex I ever had was that, one night, when I was traveling abroad in Switzerland and I met this person, right? And it was all passion and fireworks and whatever. It's basically the premise to Before Dawn?
Before sunrise.
Before Sunrise?
I think before.
Yes.
Isn't Before Dawn a vampire movie?
Probably.
Breaking Dawn.
But
No, not that one.
Not
that one.
But Before Sunrise, right? It's that there's all this passion because everything's new and whatever. And then on the other hand, we have this idea that we get really intimate and connected and maybe have a really stable home life, but we don't have that good sex, that they're kind of apart. But I think what's important here is that what Esther Perel is talking about in this article is that intimacy doesn't guarantee good sex. And what that means is that essentially they're two separate things, that having good sex and being really intimately entwined with each other don't necessarily go together. They can, and that's what we're going to talk about in this episode, but they don't necessarily. So it's not like, oh, just by becoming more close and knowing more about each other, that will cause us to have good sex. So the second thing, and this is one that I'd love to discuss with the two of you a little bit here, is that she says tension must be there. That friendship has no tension. In desire, there must be some small amount of tension. So
Yeah,
I thought this was really interesting wording of this. Yeah.
yeah, she was in a different it was a different interview with a different guy, and he was like, well, my wife, shouldn't she be my best friend? And Esther Perel was like, she better not be, because friends, in friendship there is no tension. And I found that really interesting because, again, the narrative is here in America, at least, like your wife or your partner or whomever, they are your best friend and they know you inside and out. But that is really interesting because, yeah, it doesn't cultivate like the spark potentially that perhaps you would want, especially in a really sexual relationship. So I think what she's saying is that there should be something potentially hidden, or not all of yourself, not everything that you are should be known, like it would potentially to a friend.
I don't necessarily disagree with this, but I do kind of want to play devil's advocate with it, if I can go on that journey really quick.
Yeah.
Because there's a part of me that also begs the question of like, is she saying that friendship has no tension? That's because of this dichotomy that we're traditionally used to setting up between our romantic partners and our friends. Because like my mind goes to the fact that like, if you're actually giving like weight and importance to your friendships, like there can be plenty of tension, like there's plenty of times when a friend may feel possessive of you, or maybe like really upset that you suddenly abandoned them because you got a new boyfriend. Like there's plenty of opportunities for tension. It's just that we're not used to giving it the same weight that we do to romantic tension. Again, I'm not saying that I think that this is wrong necessarily, but I'm just, kind of doing my thing of mismatching and
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's just an interesting question to ask oneself, to potentially not be as close as like a best friend would in terms of like absolutely everything being known. I think, I don't know, it's just an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, it's I feel like the trick here is that, yeah, on the one hand, it is set up with this sort of false dichotomy that I think is false between friendship and sexual relationships, that those can't be the same thing, or that those have to somehow inherently be a different type of relationship. I think her choice of the word tension is interesting, because I'm sort of like, it makes me want to have a longer conversation with her, being like, what do you mean by tension, right? What does that word mean in the way that you're using it here? But on the other hand, though, something that I've talked about a lot on this show that I've gotten from other people talking about relationships is just how very important it is to not have your romantic partner be all those things to you.
Yeah.
That if you the metaphor that I heard was basically that you don't want to have sex with the person you take out the trash with. Was kind of the cutesy way of saying that, of essentially like keeping some sort of romance and like courtship going on is important, but that person that you want to maintain a sexual relationship with can't also be the person who scolds you when you don't stick to your diet, or like tries to keep you accountable for your goals, or right, these other things that just kind of work at odds with the idea of like having that sort of mystery and excitement, and maybe creates a different kind of tension. It's not the kind of tension for this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, speaking of the mystery and excitement thing, something else she lists here is having a deep interest in the other person. And that seems like it's obvious, right? You know, that you should be interested. But I think it goes to this other level of really having an interest to I don't know, to like really continue to get to know someone over a long period of time as they shift and as they change. And it's interesting because it reminds me of an article that I read a little while ago that was, it was about relationship experts who are also dating other relationship experts and what their advice was for good relationships. And something that was in that article was actually when fighting, having a deep interest in your partner, as in having this curiosity of being willing to talk about, like, where obviously, I think obviously not necessarily like right in the thick of a fight, but being able to talk about like, these are the things that I grew up with, like these are the models of communication that I grew up with, like this is what I saw my dad do to my mom, or how did your mom talk to you about these things? Having an interest in each other as to like how your communication patterns and how your argument patterns came about. And I think it seems like that applies this, in a similar way to sex as well.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think, again, you're not necessarily going to know absolutely everything that there is to know about a person, even if you are best friends with them, or even if you have been with them for years and years. So continuing that interest and not thinking that like, oh, well, I know how this person is going to react, but instead like having a bit of wonder to the situation.
I think this segues a little bit into the next point that Emily's going to talk about, but is the idea that you're interested in the other person, like exploring them, finding new things about them, maybe even finding new things with them about themselves, rather than just, well, I know what's going to get this result and that's going to get me the thing that I want, or that I know that I want, and I'm not even going to explore myself, right? I think that interest can really go both ways and expand things for both of you, especially when we're talking sexually, where again, sort of the cultural narrative is just sort of like a thing you do to get it done, right? You kind of know what you want and that's it. You're not like exploring new things after college.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and again, the next one is going to be for better sex, you should have sex that's not results oriented, and also sex where you don't know from the beginning how it's going to end. So again, not just like doing the same positions at the same time every week in the same order, but instead like having, she said have sex with someone at midnight, in a hotel room or whatever, make it, and also, she spoke of spontaneity not being a real thing. Like there's always cues between two people regarding sex. So like sex doesn't just occur. It's like a dance that we do that's spoken about in ways, even if it's nonverbal cues.
I would even take this a step further, that I don't think spontaneity necessarily has to be any part of this. Because I know that a debate that's often been had amongst us and amongst our friends and our partners is this idea of like, can you schedule sex? Like, does it ruin it if you schedule time for it? And because for some people, and especially if you're polyamorous and you have multiple relationships, you might kind of need to, right? To just logistically work that out with someone. And I think that I just want to clarify that I think that's scheduling time for sexualness is very different from being unpredictable or being predictable, right? And just being like, well, it's like, okay, this is our time, so it's 5 past, so we better get to the heavy petting, and then in 15 minutes we're going to move on to missionary, and right, like that. It's not that. It's not like, oh, we're going to do this kind of foreplay, then we're going to have this sex, we usually do these positions, and then we're going to come in and that's it. But instead that it's like, hey, this is some time we have together, let's see where that goes, right? I think that's important to see that even if you are someone who does need to schedule sex, which I've been that person sometimes, right? That sometimes, not even just because I'm so busy, but just sometimes it's good to know when to like get in the right headspace for that. Like, when should we be a little extra flirty because now we have some time leading up to this?
So the next thing, as far as maintaining a good sex life, or a great sex life, shall we say, and this one should be pretty evident to anyone who's been listening to our show for any amount of time, which is that monogamy specifically may not be for everyone, or it may not be for you all the time necessarily. And I think, that is what I definitely appreciate about Esther Perel's stuff, is that she's not talking about all these things within this one particular framework of long-term monogamy. But I think definitely encouraging people to start thinking outside the box a little bit. That if you open up your relationship, or if you decide to be non-monogamous, it doesn't have to be full-blown polyamory. If it means, going to a play party once in a while, or if it means, 100-mile rule or whatever, as long as you're able to do it in a healthy and ethical way, then that's fine too. And that can definitely jazz up your sex life for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there have been studies done specifically about swingers, or people who practice ethical non-monogamy in a way that's like just having other sexual partners. And that there have been studies done showing that on average, they tend to report much higher levels of satisfaction in their relationships, just in general, but also especially with their sex lives. So there is even science to back this up too. This isn't us just being like, oh, fucking try this. I don't know. That there actually is some research to back that up.
It is interesting in these interviews that I read how taken aback people are by that, and how she does say, like, look, I'm not advocating cheating. I'm not saying like that is an okay thing. But if two people can come to an agreement within their specific relationship about potential non-monogamy, then more power to them. Because I think she's a realist, and throughout her work, and probably throughout seeing how often cheating comes up, quite frankly, then I think that she was like, well, it can work for some people and be great for some people.
Yeah.
And that's awesome, as we will know.
Yeah. So the next one here is actually related to one of the earlier ones we talked about, which is that sex should be unknown and unpredictable. When what she means by that is that it's not in the same place every night and not at the same time every night. So this, we talked about a little bit of like, gotta stick to the schedule, whatever. What I've found though, if I can share sort of some of my personal experience, is generally in newer relationships, or relationships where I don't see a partner very often, this doesn't come up as much. But in more established relationships, or longer term relationships, or ones where I'm living with the partner or whatever, that actually making time, whether that's scheduled time or saying, once a week, or like it's, either going to be on Wednesdays or Saturdays, like those are our sexy days. Let's like kind of keep the sort of mental, emotional space there for that. That what's interesting about it is that by doing that, I found it actually also makes these kind of sort of unpredictable, unexpected sexual things happen more often as well. Where it's like, oh, this is our day. And so we assume like once we get done with our work for the day, then we're going to do that. But somehow in the morning, we're just sort of like, hey, right? And things just go somewhere in the morning, or during, or hey. or during lunch or something like that, where it's like, gosh, I didn't expect that. I assumed we were going to do that later after we'd finished our chores and, whatever else. But I found that just scheduling time for it and kind of having it on your mind can also help that to occur in in the times and places you didn't expect. It's like, oh wow, we did that right here in the kitchen instead of in the bed like we normally do, or whatever it is. So that's just an example of, I guess I'm really like fighting hard for this whole it's okay to schedule sex thing.
Well, I think that, it's often because with my clients, I often encourage them to do things like that too. If they're finding that they're falling into a rut, or, frequency of sex is just like not satisfying to either, half the couple. But I think it's that, like, the key is that it's kind of like, it's okay to use a tool and to create a container for unpredictable things to happen. And it's kind of like finding that balance where, obviously, I think like Jace was saying earlier, it doesn't have to be down to the minute planning necessarily. Although if you're a parent, that may be what it takes.
That's
but,
possible, yeah.
Again, even just adding a little bit of structure can help to make sure that it still happens while still being allowed to be organic and unpredictable.
At the same time, if you, I think, do more sex in your life, if you make time for sex and have more sex, you're going to be thinking about it more and potentially wanting it more. I think it is important.
Sex.
Do more sex. Do the sex.
Do the sex.
Yes.
Do it more.
And that's technically what the Japanese say. You do
Really?
sex.
That's
Do
true.
the sex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, it makes more sense than having sex.
That's true. That is weird. Yeah.
It is a
If
verb.
you think about it.
Well,
yeah.
I guess it's also a noun. No.
It's funny because
We only use it as a noun because we don't say, we only say ironically to sex someone.
right. I'm sexing.
We say having.
We're sexing.
Well, yeah, you're having
But yeah, we're
sex,
having
but
it.
that's a
We're
verb.
possessing sex. That is a weird
Oh,
thing.
you're possessing it. Yeah. That's
You're having
weird.
it. Well,
Like having a seance.
well, or like having a good time. Yeah. I mean, it's
Yeah.
kind of, it
Yeah.
falls into a weird gray area, I think.
The fucking
Yeah.
English.
I
Yeah.
know, right?
No wonder it's difficult to learn. But
It's
yeah,
funny because
it-
in Russian, it's like you're occupying yourself with sex. It's kind
What?
of like
Really?
how I would
That's
translate
very
the way
odd.
you say it. Like you're spending
that
your
makes
time.
much more sense than
You're
having
spending your
sex.
time on sex. It's essentially like.
I love that.
I mean, you're spending some time
It's true.
Yeah.
Wow.
on sex.
That's funny.
On that note, yes.
Yes. What was there was something I wanted to bring up about that though. I guess just kind of thinking about it more, having it more. Right. It was that I had one particular partner, and there was something that she did that I actually really appreciated. And it was that when we were together, it was during a time where like neither of us were feeling super like sex driven a lot of the time, even though we liked having sex, but it wasn't like a big focus of our sort of day-to-day lives individually. But when we were together, it'd kind of be that time of like, well, it's a little late, we could just go to bed. I don't know if we want to have sex, we're kind of tired, it's been a busy day, like that sort of thing. And her suggestion she would make is she's like, well, how about why don't we just get naked and let's get into bed together and we'll see what happens. And if we just go to sleep, that's fine. And if we have sex, that's good too. And it was actually really nice. And I'd say more often than not, it led to sex, but it didn't always. Sometimes it would just be like, make out a little bit and then be like, I'm tired, huh? Like, yeah, me too. And we would just go to bed. So yeah, just kind of making a space for it to happen is also really nice.
Totally.
And then the last point from this article here about maintaining great sex, Esther Perel says, on some level, we trade passion for security, and that's trading one illusion for another. It's a matter of degree. We can't live in constant fear, but we can't live without any. The fear of loss is essential to love. Discuss.
Yeah.
No,
it's so
Mic
good
drop.
though. No, it's just so good because again, yes, there is that narrative that like, okay, we're married, like we're good now.
We're done.
Nothing.
Yeah.
We're done. Nothing's gonna happen in this relationship. Like I got it on lock. And yeah, she talks about like, no, you really like you got it on lease at most. Like it's not You still have to re-up and renew every time that potentially something goes wrong or something happens or there are questions there or whatever. You have to look at the relationship and you can't take it for granted in that way. And I think that's super important because so many of us do, especially in long-term relationships.
And I think a really good example of the opposite extreme of that is the relationship that I feel like many of us have had at some point in our life, which is where you're really into the person who's kind of there and then they're not, and they're kind of not always available, and they're a little inconsistent, and you can't always trust that they're actually into you, that you're always chasing after, right? Where it's like, yes, maybe that really fuels your desire for them and your passion for them, but it's not a healthy, sustainable way to have a relationship, and usually ends up just you feeling exhausted and you're always preoccupied with it, right? So she's saying it's about this balance, right?
Balance.
That we can't live in constant fear, which is what that is, which makes us so like desperate running after this person who's never giving us quite what we want. And then also being too safe and feeling like, whatever, I got it on lock,
never gonna have to worry about that person.
Never have to worry about them leaving
good.
me or anything, so who cares? Yeah.
And it's not to say that like being securely attached in a relationship is a bad thing. I think it's just that like when you're so securely attached that it does get to the point of taking them for granted a little bit, like chances are the sex is not super inspiring.
Yeah, that's been my experience at least.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so we're going to go on to autonomy, which is another very important thing to have in your relationships, also to make your relationships more inspiring. So I'm going to read from Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. So she says, "Yet in our efforts to establish intimacy, we often seek to eliminate otherness, thereby precluding the space necessary for desire to flourish. We seek intimacy to protect ourselves from feeling alone, and yet creating the distance essential to eroticism means stepping back from the comfort of our partner and feeling more alone. Our ability to tolerate our separateness and the fundamental insecurity it engenders is a precondition for maintaining interest and desire in a relationship. Instead of always striving for closeness, couples may be better off cultivating their separate selves."
Yeah.
That was a
It's
mouthful.
interesting that she calls out, the idea that separateness just fundamentally causes us to feel insecure a little bit
Yeah.
in a relationship, which is like, that's just so fascinating to me because I mean, it really speaks to how much we have been indoctrinated to, I guess with this kind of this old Judeo-Christian belief that, the two flesh shall become one.
Right.
Essentially.
Or when two become one, as the Spice Girls also said.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
That other ancient religion I'd forgotten about.
Yes.
The religion of the spice.
So it's interesting because, like in her writings, Esther Perel does talk about the fact that the desire for having autonomy sometimes can be the catalyst for infidelity in a relationship.
Yeah.
There's more and more research coming out about the fact that even if people are happy in their relationship and happy with their partner, they may still cheat. And that definitely turns on the head the narrative that we normally have of, well, they're out seeking something that they're not getting in the relationship, or they must not be in love with their partner anymore, and so that's why they're trying to be with someone else. And that may not necessarily be the case. Perel, she talks about this idea of the quest for the unexplored self, which I think is really, really interesting. So like this idea that people go out and they find someone new, and like we've said on this show many times, when you have multiple partners, each partner brings out something new in you to a certain extent. And it's the same even if you're in a monogamous relationship and you happen to be cheating, that it's that desire to be able to have an established kind of separate self or a newer self that gets brought to the surface by this other person. Perel, talks about people having an affair and it makes them feel young again, or they remember who it was that they were before they were in their marriage or in this particular long-term relationship, or it brings them back to, remembering these opportunities that they missed with other people, that brings them back to remembering who they might have been if they decided to be with some other person other than the person that they're with right now. And it's really interesting because it's kind of like if you have built your identity around this particular other person in your life, I feel like by default that means that anytime you do get to explore how that may be different, it just makes it seem even more tantalizing. And I think for some people, if that's wrapped up in another person or in an affair, it just makes it even more like juicy and tempting,
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
if you feel like that's the only time you can be yourself because all of the rest of the time is spent having this one person be everything to you, right? Like they're your one confidant, they're your one best friend, they're your one person that you have your hobbies with, that you do things with, right? That can feel very limiting, even if we might love the crap out of that person and think they're amazing and really honestly do. You're not deluding yourself into thinking that. You really think they're amazing and you want to spend all your time with them. That even then, you start to lose your sense of identity, which leads us to our first point here, which is don't forget about your other friends. Make time to hang out with your own friends, not your couple friends, but your own friends, and give time to them just as you give time to your partner or your partners.
I mean, we definitely come back to that a lot.
Yes.
'Cause it,
Yeah.
it relates to the stuff that we talk about with relationship anarchy. It just seems like whatever your relationship model is, don't forget that there's this whole other network around you that is just as important as, the people that maybe you're choosing to have a child with or to live with or to have sex with or things like that.
I think that can be
And
really...
even if
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Emily.
Oh, no, just I was going to say, and even if you are monogamous, you are going to be a different person around your friends than you are potentially around your significant other. So that'll at least give you a sense of that by being around them, a sense of otherness, a sense of autonomy, rather than just being the same person day in and day out with your significant other.
Yeah, and I think this one and the next point we're going to make can be very hard to transition to if you've found yourself in kind of a more, I'm going to say, normal kind of relationship.
Oh, don't say normal. Don't say normal. Say traditional.
A more commonplace kind of relationship where...
Well, that sounds patronizing. Sorry, I'm just going to shoot down every suggestion.
That's why I'm used to it.
Jeez.
This is why I need time with my other frids who don't shoot down
It's
my
okay.
ideas.
No, it's good. I feel very separate from you right now, so that's good for our
Yes,
relationship.
thank
Because
God.
you are.
Yeah, aside from being across the world from each other right now.
Yeah, exactly.
So however you want to describe it, hold on, I wasn't finished with my thought.
All right. What?
That if you are in this kind of a traditional relationship where you are very intertwined with each other and you only ever hang out with your friends together, that you can't just do stuff separately from each other, or just that you don't, this can be a very difficult thing to do. It can be a difficult transition. You might say, oh yeah, I'd like to do that, but like the opportunity never comes up, or it never quite seems appropriate to leave your partner to do that. And this is an instance where something like having a monthly check-in, like a radar, that you can go back and check out our episode about that a few episodes ago, having a monthly meeting can really help in your relationship to set specific tangible goals for doing this. Because I understand it. I've been there, and it's an easy place for me to go, of just spending all my time with someone and not going out and doing things separately. So having a very intentional kind of meeting with each other can be a really good way to, both for you and your partner, to make time for that, to make sure you are prioritizing that, and understanding it's not a way to escape your relationship, but a way to help, promote its growth and its, intimacy and everything.
So the next way to promote autonomy is to take time for yourself, not your friends, not anyone else, but just yourself, which can mean like a night away from your partner doing an activity on your own. Something Dedeker has done is take a retreat by yourself, or travel without your partner on a solo vacation. Something that you have done, A lot of
Not
times.
a lot of
Decker.
that.
Yeah.
Not a lot of that. I don't feel like I tend to have a lot of problems with autonomy. I mean, I
No.
certainly have, and I've certainly had some bad patches in the past, but
But I think also
never
it's
felt-
probably because of you regularly do these things.
well,
mean,
part of that
not
may
just
be also
because,
part of my
but a part
avoidant
of it.
attachment behavior, but we'll not dive into that.
I'm trying to give you a compliment.
Okay, I'll take the compliment.
Well,
Yes,
I think
good,
the
good.
good point though is that it's about balance, right? That if it's just because you can't handle being around someone all the time, then yeah, maybe address that from the other side. But having spent most of the past year with you, Dedeker, I don't think that's quite
Yeah.
what's going on at the moment.
No,
You caught
exactly.
me.
Yeah, you do spend a lot of time with people, but then you
I
also
do,
take
yes, that's true,
months for
that's true.
yourself, which is awesome.
Mhm.
And I think in the same way, like, it's great for me to get to go on trips with you guys away from my nesting partner and do things like that as well. Have opportunity for time away is incredibly important.
Yeah, definitely. The next one is just to remember that autonomy is related to having a mutual respect for each other. And we are going to dive into respect a little bit later in the second part of this episode. But just remembering to honor the things that are different about your partner, different from you, and also allowing them to honor the differences in you. And that one can be a real tricky one because for some people, it's kind of like, what's the line between what's a difference that I can live with and what's a difference that's a deal breaker to a certain extent,
Yeah. Going along with all of this is that autonomy can reduce that feeling of need for an affair or infidelity within your relationship. And it's important to remember here that infidelity can also happen in non-monogamous relationships or in polyamorous relationships. That, infidelity means some kind of other relationship that's kept secret or is outside the parameters of what you've agreed to or is somehow, dishonest or other, not just that it's with somebody else. And that having this autonomy, ironically, you might think being apart from each other more might encourage more of that, that actually, ironically, it alleviates some of the need for that because as we were talking about earlier, a lot of times that comes from just a desire to be on your own and to do your own thing and to not feel like it's always having to be worked into this one other person's life. So I think that's can be kind of a surprising thing, but is incredibly powerful to realize.
Well, that's kind of related to what we talked about in our cognitive biases episode about reactance, about, if you've set up some like rules or agreements in your relationship where one of you or both of you feels like your freedom of choice is being threatened or you feel like your autonomy is being threatened, you're going to be more likely to try to push back against that particular agreement or try to find a loophole or just straight up break a rule, It is that weird, ironic thing that, the more you try to keep your partner on a short leash, the more they're going to try to pull against
Be
that
resistant,
leash.
yeah.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
because they're a dick or anything, but just because that's kind of part of psychology, that autonomy is important for all human beings at a certain point in time. That, I think just to give a more practical example of this, that when people are making agreements, things like, gosh, I don't know, what are some ridiculous ones that I've heard lately? Things like, well, before you can sleep with someone, you need to bring them home to meet me, and I need to... and that you need to have gotten tested within the last 3 weeks and they need to have not slept with anybody in the last 6 months. Kind of creating this kind of really difficult, essentially like an agreement that's very difficult for your partner to feel autonomous, to be able to like make their own decisions about who they do sleep with or who they do choose to go on a date with. That those are the kind of things that rather than protecting your relationship are going to make it more likely that your partner's going to try to find a way around that or try to do
A
something
lot of
without
hoops
telling you.
to jump through.
Yeah.
I would even take that a step further and say any type of an agreement where I have to sign off on anyone that you want to date or that you want to have sex with, that even that, I would even go that far to say that even that,
definitely.
that I have to meet them and tell you it's okay first, that right there
Yeah,
you've
no.
eliminated that autonomy in that other relationship.
And the idea that, like, you have the ability to make a decision for yourself without, like, somebody else validating that decision. I think that's bullshit. And again, yeah, keeping autonomy from one another.
Yeah.
Not okay. So on that note, obviously we do a podcast that touches on polyamory often, and I think polyamory can really foster a sense of autonomy for a couple who was previously in a closed relationship. Obviously relationships change and grow and morph over time, but I know for me and Jace, I think it did create a different sense of like who we are, and that was such a problem for me in my monogamous relationships, was that I really got lost in them, and polyamory kind of opened up that world of me not feeling so incredibly kind of only with one person, and like that's the only box that I could fit in. Instead, it opened my horizons in so many ways. So I think that it can absolutely be a way to maintain autonomy in a relationship.
I will say, though, I don't think it's necessarily a magic bullet, because, you know,
Sure.
with the people that I've worked with, like the couples who have the most success opening up their relationships are couples who already in their relationships, autonomy, there was some autonomy. It doesn't mean they're like, you know, at an extreme level, but the idea of them both having autonomy and independence wasn't threatening from the beginning. And that definitely helped the transition a lot, because sometimes, you know, if you don't have that in your relationship already, sometimes just the main problem that people have trying to have a non-monogamous relationship is just the idea that their partner is going to be out making decisions without them, is just too threatening to people. And so, you know, I definitely encourage you, whether you want to open up your relationship someday or not, it's still a really important thing to have.
Yeah, I think I was speaking from personal knowledge that
Sure.
that I was the person who tended to create the codependency in my relationships, and that wasn't the fault of my partners, but that in a way polyamory allowed me to have the tendency to be codependent less, just simply because I was like, oh, there's other things out here and I'm allowed to enjoy and be interested in them, and it doesn't just mean like I have to box myself into what I think my relationship needs and wants.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So the last point here that we want to hit on is just the fact that there is research that shows that people who have more social resources, like more of a social network, more of a support network, if they have more people around them to talk to, whether that's just talking to, shooting the shit, or talking and processing something that's going on, that those people do a lot better when it comes to a marriage. And I'm assuming that in this context that Esther Perel means like specifically probably a long-term, like monogamous marriage.
Right.
But I think that applies to any kind of long-term relationship in general, whatever the relationship format is. And so the thing is that it's really important to know what's the balance between what am I investing in my partner or in my partners, and where can I be investing elsewhere? As in, like, what are like my friendship relationships that I can be investing in as well? What are the people outside of my romantic relationships that I can continue to invest in? And I mean, this is like I found in my own life that when I kind of started thinking about things in this way, it did really change a lot. When I started kind of treating a lot of my, what I would call quote unquote friendships, you know, like non-romantic, non-sexual relationships, once I started putting a lot more importance on them, of like trying to maintain communication, trying to like do nice things for them or give them gifts, or, you know, kind of essentially like using my love languages towards my friends as well. It really made me just generally a lot happier. And not that it's like all about me, like of course it made those relationships better as well, but like that was what I found, is that generally it just made me generally a happier person, which meant that I was a better partner, you know, in my romantic and sexual relationships.
Great. Well, I'm really excited to continue talking about this. Clearly, you know, we could talk about all this stuff forever, but we're going to have to wait until next week to finish up this discussion where we talk about our two last topics about inspiring relationships. But
On our quest for finding inspiring relationships.
yes, exactly.
It's a long, arduous quest.
Yes, but thank you for joining on this. I'm really enjoying this kind of discussion about what it is that makes relationships good. And I feel like it's so much at the heart of what this show is about a lot of the time. We deal with specific things, but this is kind of the heart of it, right? Of like, how do we have the best possible relationships regardless of the specifics of those? Like, what are the more general themes on how to have successful relationships? So I'm excited to pick this up next week.
If you'd like to have your question or comment played on the show, you can call 678-MULTI-05. You can leave us a voicemail there, or you can send us an audio message at the Multiamory Facebook page. You can email us at info@multiamory.com, or you can send us a message on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. To support our show and to join our private Facebook community, go to patreon.com/multiamory. Multiamory is created and produced by Emily Matlack, Jace Lindgren, and me, Dedeker Winston. Our episodes are edited by Mauricio. Our social media wizard is Will McMillan. Our theme song is Forms I Know I Did by Josh and Anand from the Fractal Cave EP. The full transcript is available on this episode's page on multiamory.com.